What if the father who raised you with love suddenly threw you out into the cold night because you dared to tell him the truth about who you love? Elliot stared at the kitchen table in their modest Oakwood, Illinois home, his hands trembling around the glass of water he hadn't touched. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second stretching like a rubber band about to snap. He was 18, fresh out of high school, and the words he had rehearsed for months finally spilled out in a shaky voice. "Dad, I'm gay." Robert Harlan, a burly mechanic with calloused hands and a reputation for never backing down, froze mid-bite of his sandwich. His face turned from confusion to disbelief, then to something colder than the winter wind outside. "You're what?" he growled, standing so fast the chair scraped against the linoleum. Elliot tried to explain, his voice cracking as he mentioned the confusion he had felt since middle school, the way he had dated girls just to fit in, the nights he cried alone wondering why he couldn't be normal. But Robert wasn't listening. "Get out," he said flatly, pointing at the door. "I won't have that in my house. You're no son of mine." Elliot's mother Sarah stood in the doorway, tears already streaming, but she said nothing. She never did when Robert made up his mind. Elliot packed a duffel bag in under 10 minutes. Jeans, a few shirts, his laptop, and the small photo of his grandmother who had always made him feel safe. The front door slammed behind him at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in October. He walked 3 miles to the bus station in the freezing rain, the only money in his pocket the $20 he had saved from mowing lawns. By morning he was on a Greyhound to Chicago, the city lights blurring through the window as he wondered if he would ever feel warm again. The shelter on the south side smelled of disinfectant and despair. Elliot slept on a cot that sagged in the middle, listening to the snores and quiet sobs of other lost boys. Days blurred into weeks. He washed dishes at a diner for minimum wage, crashing on a coworker's couch until that arrangement soured. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. One night, after being turned away from yet another job interview because his clothes looked too worn, he sat on a park bench and let himself cry for the first time since leaving home. The question echoed in his head again. What if the father who raised you? That was the night he met Xavier. Xavier Morales was 24, a barista at a small cafe near the lakefront with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that never seemed forced. He had overheard Elliot arguing with the shelter manager about a missing backpack and stepped in without being asked. "Hey, man, I've got an extra key to my studio. It's tiny, but it's dry. No strings." Elliot almost refused. Trust was a luxury he no longer had, but the exhaustion won. The apartment was a 5th-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a window that overlooked the L tracks. Xavier cooked spaghetti that first night, talking about nothing important, the best music to listen to when life felt heavy, how he had left his own family in Texas at 17 after they found out he was gay. Elliot listened, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. Weeks turned into months. Xavier never pushed. He helped Elliot enroll in community college at night, paid for his textbooks when the scholarship fell short, and sat with him through panic attacks when the nightmares of his father's voice came back. Their friendship deepened slowly, like roots growing under concrete. One spring evening on the rooftop, watching the city lights flicker on, Xavier said quietly, "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." Elliot turned, their shoulders brushing, and for the first time in 2 years he felt something other than fear, something warm and terrifying and real. They didn't kiss that night, but the possibility hung in the air like the first hint of summer. The years in Chicago shaped Elliot in ways he never expected. He graduated with an associate's degree in communications and landed a paid internship at a small marketing firm downtown. The work was entry-level, writing press releases, managing social media, but it gave him purpose. Xavier, now a shift supervisor at the cafe, encouraged him every step. "You're building something," he would say while they shared cheap takeout on the tiny balcony. Elliot started volunteering at the local LGBTQ center, helping other teens who had been kicked out just like him. The stories he heard mirrored his own so closely that some nights he came home silent, needing Xavier's quiet presence on the couch to remind him he had survived. But survival wasn't the same as healing. Every holiday, Elliot stared at his phone, debating whether to call his mother. Sarah texted occasionally, short messages like, "Miss you," or "Be safe," but never mentioned Robert. Elliot learned through a distant cousin that his father had started drinking more heavily after he left, that the garage he worked at had cut hours, that the family home now felt emptier. The knowledge brought no satisfaction, only a hollow ache. Xavier noticed the distance. One night, after Elliot snapped over something trivial, Xavier sat him down. "You're still waiting for him to change, aren't you?" Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he told Xavier about the day his father taught him to change a tire, how proud Robert had looked when Elliot got it right. "He was my hero once," Elliot whispered. Xavier pulled him close, not saying anything profound, just holding him until the shaking stopped. Their relationship had grown into something steady and deep. Late-night talks about dreams, shared laughter over silly arguments, the kind of love that felt like home. Elliot still flinched when strangers stared too long on the train, but Xavier's hand in his made the world feel a little less hostile. Then came the misunderstanding that nearly broke them. A co-worker at the firm, a guy named Marcus who had always been friendly, invited Elliot to a happy hour. Halfway through the evening, Marcus made a crude joke about gay guys always having drama. Elliot laughed it off at first, but when Marcus pushed further, asking if Elliot's roommate knew he was just experimenting, Elliot walked out. He got home furious, convinced Xavier would see the same prejudice everywhere. Xavier listened, then reminded him gently, "Not everyone is your dad." The argument lasted into the early hours, both of them exhausted and raw. Elliot realized he had projected his father's rejection on Xavier, expecting betrayal where there was only support. They made up at sunrise, Xavier's forehead pressed against his. "We choose each other every day," Xavier said. "That's what matters." Elliot's career took off after that. He pitched a campaign for a local nonprofit focused on homeless LGBTQ youth, and it went viral. The firm promoted him to junior account manager. Money was finally stable. He and Xavier moved into a one-bedroom in Logan Square with actual sunlight and a kitchen big enough for two. Life felt almost normal until the letter arrived. Sarah's handwriting on the envelope made Elliot's stomach drop. Inside was a single page. "Your father had a heart attack. He's asking for you. Please come home." Elliot stared at the words for a long time. Xavier read it over his shoulder and said nothing, just squeezed his hand. The decision wasn't easy. Part of Elliot wanted to burn the letter. Another part, the boy who still remembered fishing trips and bedtime stories, couldn't ignore it. He booked a train ticket for the following weekend. Oakwood looked smaller than Elliot remembered. The streets were the same cracked sidewalks, the same faded American flags on porches. He walked up to the house he grew up in, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Sarah opened the door before he knocked, pulling him into a hug that smelled like the same lavender soap from his childhood. She looked older, lines around her eyes deeper. "He's resting," she said quietly. "The doctors say he'll recover, but he's different now." Robert was in the living room recliner, an oxygen tube under his nose, the television muted on a baseball game. When he saw Elliot, his face did something complicated: surprise, shame, something almost like relief. "Son," he rasped, voice weaker than Elliot had ever heard. Elliot stood frozen in the doorway. The word "son" felt like a key turning in a lock he thought had rusted shut. They didn't talk much that first visit. Robert apologized in fragments. "I was wrong, scared, didn't know how to handle it." But Elliot wasn't ready to forgive. He spent the night in his old room, staring at the ceiling cracks he used to trace as a kid, Xavier texting him from Chicago, "You don't owe him anything, but you owe yourself peace." The week stretched into 2. Elliot helped around the house, fixed the leaky faucet his father could no longer reach, drove Sarah to the grocery store. Slowly, pieces of the past surfaced. Robert admitted he had lost friends at the garage after word spread about Elliot. He had started going to a support group at the VA, not for drinking, but for something he called regret that won't let go. Elliot listened without interrupting, but the anger still simmered. One afternoon in the garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, Robert said, "I see kids like you on the news now." "Brave." "I wasn't." Elliot walked out without answering, tears burning his eyes. Xavier drove down for the weekend. Seeing the two of them together in the kitchen, Xavier chopping vegetables while Elliot laughed at some story, softened something in Robert. He didn't say much, but he set an extra plate at the table. That night, after Xavier had gone to bed in the guest room, Robert sat on the porch with Elliot. "He seems good for you," he muttered. Elliot nodded. "He saved me when you threw me away." The words landed heavy. Robert looked down at his hands and said nothing more. Back in Chicago, life resumed but felt different. Elliot threw himself into work, landing a full-time position at a larger agency specializing in social impact campaigns. He and Xavier celebrated with a weekend trip to Michigan, walking the dunes hand in hand, talking about maybe adopting a dog someday. The future felt possible. But the call from Sarah came 3 months later. "Your father wants to go public. He says he needs to make it right before it's too late." The public part turned out to be a local television station in Chicago that was doing a segment on family reconciliation and LGBTQ acceptance. Robert had contacted them himself after seeing an article about Elliot's viral campaign. The producers reached out to Elliot directly, asking if he would participate. At first he refused. "I'm not a prop for his redemption arc," he told Xavier over dinner. Xavier listened, then asked the question that stuck. What if this is his way of kneeling? Elliot spent days wrestling with it. He talked to his therapist, to friends at the center, even to his mother on long phone calls. The betrayal he felt years ago still ached, but so did the memory of Robert teaching him to ride a bike, of the man who once fixed every broken thing in their house. Xavier reminded him quietly, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's choosing not to let the past own you. In the end, Elliot said yes, but on his terms. No scripted lines. No forced hugs. Just the truth. The studio was smaller than he expected, bright lights and a green couch. Robert arrived in a suit that hung a little loose, oxygen tank discreetly tucked behind the set. When the cameras rolled, the host asked gentle questions. Elliot spoke first, voice steady, about the night he was kicked out, the years of wondering if he was broken, the way Xavier had become his family when blood failed him. Robert listened, eyes wet. When it was his turn, he looked straight at the camera and then at Elliot. "I was wrong," he said, voice cracking on live television. "I hurt my son because I was scared of what people would think. I lost years I can never get back." The segment ended with a quiet moment. No dramatic music, no swelling strings, just two men sitting in silence, the weight of decades between them. Viewers flooded the station with messages. Some praised Robert for his courage. Others called it too little too late. Elliot walked out of the studio feeling raw but lighter. Xavier waited outside, coat open, arms ready. They didn't speak on the drive home. They didn't need to. Life after the interview changed in small ways. Robert started calling once a week, awkward conversations about the weather or the Cubs. Sarah sounded happier than she had in years. Elliot and Xavier moved into a bigger place in Wicker Park, a 2-bedroom with room for a desk and a dog they named Max. Work promotions came steadily. Elliot began mentoring young men at the center, sharing his story without the bitterness that used to color every word. But not everything was smooth. An old high school friend from Oakwood reached out on social media, congratulating him on the interview, but adding in a private message, "Your dad looked pathetic. You really forgive that?" The comment reopened old wounds. Elliot almost replied with anger, but Xavier stopped him. "You don't owe anyone your pain anymore." Instead, Elliot blocked the account and took Max for a long walk, letting the city noise drown out the echo of old judgments. 2 years passed in a blur of ordinary happiness. Elliot turned 30. Xavier proposed on a quiet evening at the lakefront with nothing but the sound of waves and a simple silver ring. They planned a small ceremony for the following spring. Close friends, Sarah flying in, no big production. Robert asked if he could come. Elliot said yes, but the anxiety crept in anyway. He woke up nights imagining old arguments resurfacing, old prejudices slipping out. Xavier held him through it. "We've built something stronger than his mistakes," he whispered. The ceremony was set for a community center garden in April, cherry blossoms just starting to bloom. 50 people, string lights, a playlist of songs that had carried them through hard years. Robert arrived early, helping set up chairs despite the doctor's warnings. He looked frail but determined. Elliot watched him from across the lawn and felt the old knot loosen another inch. The misunderstanding came the day before. A distant cousin posted on Facebook about the wedding, tagging Robert with a comment that read, "Proud of how far you've come after everything with Elliot." The post went semi-viral in their small-town circles. Robert called, voice tight. I don't want people thinking I'm doing this for show. Elliot felt the old anger flare. Here was his father still worried about appearances. They argued on the phone for 20 minutes, both men exhausted by the same old dance. Xavier took the phone at one point and said calmly, "This isn't about them. It's about your son getting married tomorrow." Robert went quiet. When he spoke again, he said, "Tell Elliot I'll be there. And I mean it." The night before the wedding, Elliot couldn't sleep. He walked to the garden alone and sat on the bench where they would exchange vows. The question that had started everything years ago came back, softer now. What if the father who threw you out, he realized the answer had changed? It wasn't about what his father had done. It was about what Elliot had become despite it. The ceremony day dawned bright and cool. Guests filled the garden, laughter mixing with the scent of flowers. When it was time for the vows, Elliot stood facing Xavier, the words they had written together flowing easily, promises of partnership, of choosing each other through every storm. Rings were exchanged. Applause rose. Then the officiant invited anyone who wanted to speak. Robert stood slowly. The crowd hushed. He walked to the front, not to the microphone, but directly to Elliot. In front of everyone, family, friends, strangers who had come for the celebration, Robert lowered himself to one knee, the same way he had once taught Elliot to tie his shoes. His voice carried clearly. "I threw my son away because I was afraid. Today I stand here, kneel here, asking for the forgiveness I don't deserve. Elliot, you became the man I never had the courage to be. I'm proud of you. I love you. And I'm sorry in front of every single person here." Tears streamed down Elliot's face. The crowd was silent. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first, then louder. Elliot pulled his father up and hugged him. Awkward, fierce, years of distance collapsing in seconds. Xavier joined them, one arm around each, the three men forming a quiet circle while the blossoms drifted down. Sarah cried openly in the front row. Max barked once from his spot by the cake table, as if approving. Later, at the reception, Robert sat with Elliot and Xavier, telling stories about Elliot as a boy that made everyone laugh. No grand speeches. No perfect ending. Just three men who had survived different kinds of pain and found their way back to each other. Elliot looked at Xavier across the table and felt the full weight of the journey, the nights on park benches, the arguments, the slow rebuilding. He had become someone who could stand tall without needing his father's approval. And yet, having it now felt like the final piece sliding into place. The party went late into the night. Elliot danced with Xavier under the string lights, the question that had haunted him for so long finally answered in the simplest way possible. You keep going. You build your own family. And sometimes, if you're lucky and brave enough, the people who hurt you find the courage to come home. In the end, this story reminds us that rejection can break a person, but it doesn't have to define them. Elliot's journey shows that love, whether from a partner, chosen family, or even a father who finally sees the light, is worth the fight. The real lesson isn't about forcing forgiveness. It's about refusing to let someone else's prejudice steal your future. Growth happens in the quiet choices we make after the door slams shut. And sometimes, years later, that same door cracks open again, not because we begged, but because we became the kind of person worth coming back for.